Part 3, Swann in Love, Section 17. And so, by the chemical process of his malady, after he had created jealousy out of his love, he began again to generate tenderness, pity for Odette. She had become once more the old Odette, charming and kind. He was full of remorse for having treated her harshly. He wished her to come to him, and, before she came, he wished to have already procured for her some pleasure, so as to watch her gratitude taking shape in her face and molding her smile. So, too, Odette, certain of seeing him come to her in a few days, as tender and submissive as before, and plead with her for a reconciliation, became inured, was no longer afraid of displeasing him, or even of making him angry, and refused him, whenever it suited her, the favors by which he set most store. Perhaps she did not realize how sincere he had been with her during their quarrel, when he had told her that he would not send her any money, but would do what he could to hurt her. Perhaps she did not realize, either, how sincere he still was, if not with her, at any rate with himself, on other occasions when, for the sake of their future relations, to show Odette that he was capable of doing without her, that a rupture was still possible between them, he decided to wait some time before going to see her again. Sometimes several days had elapsed, during which she had caused him no fresh anxiety, and as, from the next few visits which he would pay her, he knew that he was likely to derive not any great pleasure, but, more probably, some annoyance which would put an end to the state of calm in which he found himself, he wrote to her that he was very busy, and would not be able to see her on any of the days that he had suggested. Meanwhile, a letter from her, crossing his, asked him to postpone one of those very meetings. He asked himself why. His suspicions, his grief, again took hold of him. He could no longer abide, in the new state of agitation into which he found himself plunged, by the arrangements which he had made in his preceding state of comparative calm. He would run to find her, and would insist upon seeing her on each of the following days. And even if she had not written first, if she merely acknowledged his letter, it was enough to make him unable to rest without seeing her. For, upsetting all Swann's calculations, Odette's acceptance had entirely changed his attitude. Like every one who possesses something precious, so as to know what would happen if he ceased for a moment to possess it, he had detached the precious object from his mind, leaving, as he thought, everything else in the same state as when it was there. But the absence of one part from a whole is not only that, it is not simply a partial omission, it is a disturbance of all the other parts, a new state which it was impossible to foresee from the old. But at other times, when Odette was on the point of going away for a holiday, it was after some trifling quarrel for which he had chosen the pretext, that he decided not to write to her and not to see her until her return, giving the appearance and expecting the reward of a serious rupture, which she would perhaps regard as final to a separation, the greater part of which was inevitable since she was going away, which, in fact, he was merely allowing to start a little sooner than it must. At once he could imagine Odette, puzzled, anxious, distressed at having received neither visit nor letter from him, and this picture of her, by calming his jealousy, made it easy for him to break himself of the habit of seeing her. At odd moments, no doubt, in the furthest recesses of his brain, where his determination had thrust it away, and thanks to the length of the interval, the 3 weeks' separation to which he had agreed, it was with pleasure that he would consider the idea that he would see Odette again on her return. But it was also with so little impatience that he began to ask himself whether he would not readily consent to the doubling of the period of so easy an abstinence. It had lasted so far but 3 days, a much shorter time than he had often before passed without seeing Odette, and without having, as on this occasion he had, premeditated a separation. And yet, there and then, some tiny trace of contrariety in his mind, or of weakness in his body, by inciting him to regard the present as an exceptional moment, one not to be governed by the rules, one in which prudence itself would allow him to take advantage of the soothing effects of a pleasure, and to give his will, until the time should come when its efforts might serve any purpose, a holiday; suspended the action of his will, which ceased to exert its inhibitive control; or, without that even, the thought of some information for which he had forgotten to ask Odette, such as if she had decided in what color she would have her carriage repainted, or, with regard to some investment, whether they were ordinary or preference shares that she wished him to buy. For it was all very well to show her that he could live without seeing her, but if, after that, the carriage had to be painted over again, if the shares produced no dividend, a fine lot of good he would have done. And suddenly, like a stretched piece of elastic which is let go, or the air in a pneumatic machine which is ripped open, the idea of seeing her again, from the remote point in time to which it had been attached, sprang back into the field of the present and of immediate possibilities. It sprang back thus, without meeting any further resistance; so irresistible, in fact, that Swann had been far less unhappy in watching the end gradually approaching, day by day, of the fortnight which he must spend apart from Odette, than he was when kept waiting 10 minutes while his coachman brought round the carriage which was to take him to her, minutes which he passed in transports of impatience and joy, in which he recaptured 1,000 times over, to lavish on it all the wealth of his affection, that idea of his meeting with Odette, which, by so abrupt a repercussion, at a moment when he supposed it so remote, was once more present and on the very surface of his consciousness. The fact was that this idea no longer found, as an obstacle in its course, the desire to contrive without further delay to resist its coming, which had ceased to have any place in Swann's mind since, having proved to himself, or so at least he believed, that he was so easily capable of resisting it, he no longer saw any inconvenience in postponing a plan of separation which he was now certain of being able to put into operation whenever he would. Furthermore, this idea of seeing her again came back to him adorned with a novelty, a seductiveness, armed with a virulence, all of which long habit had enfeebled, but which had acquired new vigor during this privation, not of 3 days, but of a fortnight, for a period of abstinence may be calculated by anticipation as having lasted already until the final date assigned to it, and had converted what had been until then a pleasure in store, which could easily be sacrificed, into an unlooked-for happiness which he was powerless to resist. Finally, the idea returned to him with its beauty enhanced by his own ignorance of what Odette might have thought, might, perhaps, have done, on finding that he showed no sign of life, with the result that he was going now to meet with the entrancing revelation of an Odette almost unknown. But she, just as she had supposed that his refusal to send her money was only a feint, saw nothing but a pretext in the question which he came, now, to ask her, about the repainting of her carriage, or the purchase of stock. For she could not reconstruct the several phases of these crises through which he had passed, and in the general idea which she formed of them, she made no attempt to understand their mechanism, looking only to what she knew beforehand, their necessary, never failing, and always identical termination. An imperfect idea, though possibly all the more profound in consequence, if one were to judge it from the point of view of Swann, who would doubtless have considered that Odette failed to understand him, just as a morphinomaniac or a consumptive, each persuaded that he has been thrown back, one by some outside event, at the moment when he was just going to shake himself free from his inveterate habit, the other by an accidental indisposition at the moment when he was just going to be finally cured, feels himself to be misunderstood by the doctor, who does not attach the same importance to these pretended contingencies, mere disguises, according to him, assumed, so as to be perceptible by his patients, by the vice of one and the morbid state of the other, which in reality have never ceased to weigh heavily and incurably upon them while they were nursing their dreams of normality and health. And, as a matter of fact, Swann's love had reached that stage at which the physician and, in the case of certain affections, the boldest of surgeons, ask themselves whether to deprive a patient of his vice or to rid him of his malady is still reasonable or indeed possible. Certainly, of the extent of this love Swann had no direct knowledge. When he sought to measure it, it happened sometimes that he found it diminished, shrunken almost to nothing. For instance, the very moderate liking, amounting almost to dislike, which in the days before he was in love with Odette he had felt for her expressive features, her faded complexion, returned on certain days. "Really, I am making distinct headway," he would tell himself on the morrow. "When I come to think it over carefully, I find out that I got hardly any pleasure last night out of being in bed with her. It's an odd thing, but I actually thought her ugly." And certainly he was sincere, but his love extended a long way beyond the province of physical desire. Odette's person, indeed, no longer held any great place in it. When his eyes fell upon the photograph of Odette on his table, or when she came to see him, he had difficulty in identifying her face, either in the flesh or on the pasteboard, with the painful and continuous anxiety which dwelt in his mind. He would say to himself almost with astonishment, "It is she," as when suddenly some one shows us in a detached, externalized form one of our own maladies, and we find in it no resemblance to what we are suffering. She? He tried to ask himself what that meant, for it is something like love, like death, rather than like those vague conceptions of maladies, a thing which one repeatedly calls in question in order to make oneself probe further into it, in the fear that the question will find no answer, that the substance will escape our grasp, the mystery of personality. And this malady, which was Swann's love, had so far multiplied, was so closely interwoven with all his habits, with all his actions, with his thoughts, his health, his sleep, his life, even with what he hoped for after his death, was so entirely one with him that it would have been impossible to wrest it away without almost entirely destroying him. As surgeons say, his case was past operation. By this love Swann had been so far detached from all other interests that when by chance he reappeared in the world of fashion, reminding himself that his social relations, like a beautifully wrought setting, although she would not have been able to form any very exact estimate of its worth, might still add a little to his own value in Odette's eyes, as indeed they might have done had they not been cheapened by his love itself, which for Odette depreciated everything that it touched, by seeming to denounce such things as less precious than itself. He would feel there, simultaneously with his distress at being in places and among people that she did not know, the same detached sense of pleasure as he would have derived from a novel or a painting, in which were depicted the amusements of a leisured class. Just as, at home, he used to enjoy the thought of the smooth efficiency of his household, the smartness of his own wardrobe and of his servants' liveries, the soundness of his investments, with the same relish as when he read in Saint-Simon, who was one of his favorite authors, of the machinery of daily life at Versailles, what Madame de Maintenon ate and drank, or the shrewd avarice and great pomp of Lully. And in the small extent to which this detachment was not absolute, the reason for this new pleasure which Swann was tasting was that he could emigrate for a moment into those few and distant parts of himself which had remained almost foreign to his love and to his pain. In this respect, the personality with which my great aunt endowed him of young Swann, as distinct from the more individual personality of Charles Swann, was that in which he now most delighted. Once when, because it was the birthday of the Princesse de Parme, and because she could often be of use, indirectly, to Odette, by letting her have seats for galas and jubilees and all that sort of thing, he had decided to send her a basket of fruit, and was not quite sure where or how to order it. He had entrusted the task to a cousin of his mother, who, delighted to be doing a commission for him, had written to him, laying stress on the fact that she had not chosen all the fruit at the same place, but the grapes from Crapaud, whose speciality they were, the strawberries from Jaurès, the pears from Chevet, who always had the best, and soon every fruit visited and examined one by myself. And in the sequel, by the cordiality with which the Princess thanked him, he had been able to judge of the flavor of the strawberries and of the ripeness of the pears. But, most of all, that every fruit visited and examined one by myself had brought balm to his sufferings by carrying his mind off to a region which he rarely visited, although it was his by right, as the heir of a rich and respectable middle class family, in which had been handed down from generation to generation the knowledge of the right places and the art of ordering things from shops. Of a truth, he had too long forgotten that he was young Swann not to feel, when he assumed that part again for a moment, a keener pleasure than he was capable of feeling at other times, when indeed he was grown sick of pleasure, and if the friendliness of the middle class people, for whom he had never been anything else than young Swann, was less animated than that of the aristocrats, though more flattering, for all that, since in the middle class mind friendship is inseparable from respect. No letter from a royal personage, offering him some princely entertainment, could ever be so attractive to Swann as the letter which asked him to be a witness, or merely to be present at a wedding, in the family of some old friends of his parents, some of whom had kept up with him, like my grandfather, who, the year before these events, had invited him to my mother's wedding, while others barely knew him by sight, but were, they thought, in duty bound to show civility to the son, to the worthy successor of the late M. Swann. But, by virtue of his intimacy, already time honored, with so many of them, the people of fashion, in a certain sense, were also a part of his house, his service, and his family. He felt, when his mind dwelt upon his brilliant connections, the same external support, the same solid comfort as when he looked at the fine estate, the fine silver, the fine table linen, which had come down to him from his forebears; and the thought that, if he were seized by a sudden illness and confined to the house, the people whom his valet would instinctively run to find would be the Duc de Chartres, the Prince de Ruse, the Duc de Luxembourg, and the Baron de Charlus, brought him the same consolation as our old Françoise derived from the knowledge that she would one day be buried in her own fine clothes, marked with her name, not darned at all, or so exquisitely darned that it merely enhanced one's idea of the skill and patience of the seamstress, a shroud from the constant image of which in her mind's eye she drew a certain satisfactory sense, if not actually of wealth and prosperity, at any rate of self-esteem. But most of all, since in every one of his actions and thoughts which had reference to Odette, Swann was constantly subdued and swayed by the unconfessed feeling that he was, perhaps not less dear, but at least less welcome to her than any one, even the most wearisome of the Verdurin's faithful, when he betook himself to a world in which he was the paramount example of taste, a man whom no pains were spared to attract, whom people were genuinely sorry not to see. He began once again to believe in the existence of a happier life, almost to feel an appetite for it, as an invalid may feel who has been in bed for months, and on a strict diet, when he picks up a newspaper and reads the account of an official banquet, or the advertisement of a cruise round Sicily. If he was obliged to make excuses to his fashionable friends for not paying them visits, it was precisely for the visits that he did pay her that he sought to excuse himself to Odette. He still paid them, asking himself at the end of each month whether, seeing that he had perhaps exhausted her patience, and had certainly gone rather often to see her, it would be enough if he sent her 4,000 francs, and for each visit he found a pretext, a present that he had to bring her, some information which she required, Monsieur de Charlus, whom he had met actually going to her house, and who had insisted upon Swann's accompanying him. And, failing any excuse, he would beg Monsieur de Charlus to go to her at once and to tell her, as though spontaneously, in the course of conversation, that he had just remembered something that he had to say to Swann, and would she please send a message to Swann's house, asking him to come to her then and there. But as a rule Swann waited at home in vain, and Monsieur de Charlus informed him later in the evening that his device had not proved successful, with the result that, if she was now frequently away from Paris, even when she was there he scarcely saw her; that she who, when she was in love with him, used to say, "I am always free, and what can it matter to me what other people think?" now, whenever he wanted to see her, appealed to the proprieties or pleaded some engagement. When he spoke of going to a charity entertainment, or a private view, or a first night at which she was to be present, she would expostulate that he wished to advertise their relations in public, that he was treating her like a woman off the streets. Things came to such a pitch that, in an effort to save himself from being altogether forbidden to meet her anywhere, Swann, remembering that she knew and was deeply attached to my great uncle Adolph, whose friend he himself also had been, went one day to see him in his little flat in the Rue de Bellechasse, to ask him to use his influence with Odette. As it happened, she invariably adopted, when she spoke to Swann about my uncle, a poetical tone, saying, "Ah, he is not in the least like you. It is an exquisite thing, a great, a beautiful thing, his friendship for me. He's not the sort of man who would have so little consideration for me as to let himself be seen with me everywhere in public." This was embarrassing for Swann, who did not know quite to what rhetorical pitch he should screw himself up in speaking of Odette to my uncle. He began by alluding to her excellence, a priori, the axiom of her seraphic superhumanity, the revelation of her inexpressible virtues, no conception of which could possibly be formed. "I should like to speak to you about her," he went on, "you who know what a woman supreme above all women, what an adorable being, what an angel Odette is. But you know also what life is in Paris. Every one doesn't see Odette in the light in which you and I have been privileged to see her. And so there are people who think that I am behaving rather foolishly. She won't even allow me to meet her out of doors, at the theatre. Now you, in whom she has such enormous confidence, couldn't you say a few words for me to her, just to assure her that she exaggerate the harm which my bowing to her in the street might do her?" End of Part 3, Section 17.